The zoo in Zurich, Switzerland hadn't had a great few years. In 2019, they were lucky enough to be one of the few establishments in the country to stay open for the first phase of lockdowns during the pandemic. But that small blessing was revoked when a crocodile attacked an employee during their scheduled morning cleanup. The croc, luckily a smaller specimen, grabbed the man's hand and wouldn't let go. 3 other employees had to jump in to pry the creature's jaws off before it finally released the man. The employee suffered permanent damage to his hand, but was otherwise all right, shaken but fine, all things considered. The same cannot be said for the Philippine freshwater crocodile. It was euthanized that same day. Unfortunately, authorities decided that the zoo wouldn't be staying open after all, so the staff were reduced to a skeleton crew for more than a year before restrictions could finally be lifted. At last, in June 2020, the zoo commenced operations. The staff were overjoyed. Even the animals seemed to have an extra spring in their step after such a long time in confinement, with barely any movement around them for more than a year. The first month went by as if no one had ever been under lockdown. Every keeper and vet operated like a well-oiled machine, just as they always had. In July, a 55-year-old longtime employee of the zoo, whose name has been kept out of the papers, out of respect for her and her family, was on duty that morning. Vera, as we'll be referring to her, was on water duty on that Saturday. The early morning feedings were completed before opening time, as well as the animals' first helping of water. But by noon, almost all of the troughs were muddied or completely empty. July in Switzerland is summer when the days are long, muggy, and humid, so the creatures drank more than usual to keep up with the heat. Naturally, Saturday was busier than usual. All the children in Zurich seemed to have come out for some fresh air after a year indoors. And what better way to get out and about than to spend it with all of the wildlife that Zurich Zoo has to offer? Vera, alongside 3 other employees, were tasked with the zoo's west side exhibits, where all the predators are kept. Only the most experienced keepers are trusted to go into those enclosures, and every single enclosure, no matter how benign or dangerous the animals are, has the same 3-step system to ensure the utmost safety of the humans in charge of handling them. Their feeding areas are completely separate from their much larger habitat, and animals can only receive their food after the gate behind them has been locked securely. After the feeding enclosure is an in-between space where water is kept. This space has 2 gates, one through which to enter from outside, and another that leads to the main habitat. Once a specimen moves to their large day holding where the toys, grass, and trees are, that gate is locked so that the keeper can clean out water trays, add food to bowls, and all of the other things that might need attention. At all times, a caregiver is protected by at least 2 locked gates. Only today, Vera allowed her sense of habit to overshadow her attention to detail. She finished up the lynxes, the lions, and the gray wolves, ending at the very last exhibit, that of Irina, the Siberian tiger, Zurich Zoo's most prized possession. She opened the first gate, locked it behind her with her free hand since the other was holding a bucket and soap. Moving through the corridor, she entered the watering area where she opened and locked the next gate, letting herself in, leaving only the gate leading to the large enclosure ahead of her unchecked. The gate was swung shut, but not latched. If Vera looked closer, she'd have seen that the gate was standing slightly ajar. She should have gone to lock that gate too, but with her free hand she was waving at some children who had their noses pressed up against the glass. The delighted waves and giggles from the kids completely washed the final step of her entry from her mind, and Vera never checked that last gate. Unfortunately, nothing misses a Siberian tiger's sharp eyes. Irina might have been young, inexperienced, and had never hunted in her life, but she was in every way just as alert as her kind are known to be. The moment Vera's back was turned and she was engrossed with scrubbing out the water trough, Irina moved. Silent as a ghost, she slinked toward the open door. The children and their parents watched her, not realizing that Irina was moving with that telltale shoulder shimmy that meant she was in full stalking mode. When Irina reached the door, she pawed it open. Zurich Zoo keeps its facility incredibly well maintained, so there wasn't even a squeak from the hinges as the cat opened it. Vera didn't hear a thing. That's when it clicked for the people looking through the glass. Even the children saw what was about to happen. They banged and screamed at Vera's back, who couldn't hear them through the thick safety glass. As the tiger's tail disappeared through the gate, one woman turned from the glass and ran to the nearest park employee to alert them. But the woman had barely taken 2 steps toward the security guard when Irina pounced on Vera's back. Vera was thrust into the trough as the cat's nails sliced clean through her reflective jacket and raked into her back. Vera managed to get one startled scream out before Irina yanked her backward. The force was so great that the tiger's nails tore out of Vera's back, throwing the woman out the open gate and into the habitat, in full view of the crowd now gathered at the viewing glass. Children were dragged away by their parents to spare them the sight of a fully grown tiger now on top of the zookeeper. Irina had Vera pinned to the ground, and she aimed for the woman's throat, but got her in the face instead. Vera's entire cheek was ripped off, exposing the teeth beneath it. Her hysterical screams of pain were even louder than the yells from behind the glass. Just as staff stormed into the enclosure, Irina went in for the kill, and this time she didn't miss. She sunk her teeth into Vera's throat. Most likely, the tiger was planning on suffocating the woman to death, but the swarm of people coming toward them forced Irina to let go. Vera's carotid artery was severed, and the moment that the tiger released the pressure, Vera's lifeblood started jetting out of her, pumping with the beat of her own heart. The spray was so intense that it covered the shoes of the zookeepers 7 feet away. Irina wasn't willing to just let her hard-won prey go at first, and it took quite a bit of coaxing to get her back behind the safety of the locked gate where she dragged Vera from in the first place. When staff were able to get to Vera, almost 2 minutes after she'd been bitten, she'd already bled out from her mortal wound, and the crowd behind the glass had seen it all. You'd think that after the zoo's extreme measures regarding the crocodile who'd just bitten someone's hand, that Irina's fate was sealed. But no. After months of deliberation, the courts ruled that this terrible tragedy was a result of human negligence, and that Irina could not be sentenced to death for acting according to her nature. Employees can now no longer operate without a partner, but that should have been a rule long before this incident. But other than that, there were no further repercussions, except for some serious therapy for all those who witnessed the attack. At least a fair ruling was able to spare Irina, so that we didn't have to report on 2 senseless deaths. 1 victim is bad enough already. As for Irina, she's still in Zurich and doing great. Let's just hope that her first taste of human blood did not awaken the desire to bring another person to their final affliction.
Mike Hodge and his wife Chrissy moved to South Africa 30 years ago, all to pursue Mike's passion for the magnificent African wildlife. Mike specialized in the most fearsome of them all, the mighty African lion. In less than 10 years, Mike and Chrissy overhauled their little oasis in the bush into a sanctuary where injured lions, abandoned cubs, and a fair number of other wildlife found their permanent home. Marakele Animal Sanctuary wasn't just known for its game drives and regular old African safari-style entertainment. Mike and Chrissy had lions, cheetahs, and leopards right in the heart of the property. Some of the animals brought in were so injured when they were found that they'd never survive on their own in the wild. But thanks to Mike and Chrissy, they were held in massive enclosures so that they could live long and healthy lives as close to their original environments as possible. Mike was never in the business of raising circus animals who'd do backflips for a treat. He understood the nature of a wild animal better than anyone. Even the cubs that they raised by hand were never left alone with other humans. And whenever Mike or his staff entered an enclosure, even as friendly as the lions were, someone always had a loaded hunting rifle at the ready, just in case. And for the more sensitive of our viewers, this rather extreme precaution amongst seemingly tame kittens was what ultimately saved Mike's life. His playful cats that he'd fed in the night and raised on his lap were never underestimated, and guests were allowed to view them but never feed or interact personally with the predators, just like it would have been in the wild. The only real difference here was that the cats were supplied food by the staff, and with the high fence line, visitors could view them closer than they would have on a game drive out in the wild. Shamba, the biggest of Mike's captive lions, was the main attraction for everyone. He was found as the lone surviving cub of his litter, his mother probably killed by another predator. Between Mike and Chrissy, they fed Shamba bottles by hand and allowed him to sleep on their laps so that he wouldn't mewl and cry in the night for his lost siblings and mother. Mike liked to entertain visitors by going into Shamba's enclosure and feeding him by hand, and showing them how the mighty beast loved a scratch behind the ears. This was exactly the case on May 2nd, 2018. Mike and his wife were now in their early 70s, and at a time when most people would have long since retired, they were still going strong and accepting more guests than ever. Chrissy had received a group of 3 married couples, all in their late 30s, from America the night before. The group were planning on spending the next 2 days exploring the reserve and shaking off their jet lag. After a good night's sleep, Mike and his best tour guide, Lubanzi, took the group out bright and early. Lubanzi noticed that Shamba was not his usual self, and the guide, an expert in his field, thought he knew what it was. Inside Shamba's enclosure there was the unmistakable musk left behind by a badger. Apparently, the ferocious little beast had gotten into the lion's space the night before and left its scent everywhere that it could reach. Lubanzi used Shamba's breakfast to keep the lion's attention occupied elsewhere so that he could try to find the badger, but apparently the animal had gone off to find someone else to terrorize. He reported his suspicions to Mike, but besides Shamba being a little on edge, there wasn't much else they could do until they caught and relocated the badger. They drove the armored jeep, spotting out the various bucks, elephants, and even a herd of zebras. The morning was everything that an African safari promised to be on the brochures. After a quick lunch under the canopy of the trees, the group was taken to the fenced-in enclosures where the permanent rescues stayed, starting with a pair of springbuck babies that were being fed milk from handheld bottles. They worked their way up to the more exotic creatures, including 2 cheetahs and a mean-tempered serval cat who wasn't willing to come out to greet them. They ended the ride with a visit to Shamba's enclosure, where Mike got out and confidently entered through the high gates. Lubanzi followed, his rifle slung over his shoulder, as was protocol. The couples had been eagerly awaiting this part of the trip all day. Shamba's reputation was legendary, and Mike's handling of him was nothing short of awe-inspiring. Unlike every other visit, Shamba did not bound over to Mike with excitement. Instead, he had his nose on the ground, still sniffing at the musk that last night's intruder had left behind. When Mike walked up to him, Shamba didn't see his old friend. He was in the throes of being territorial. He was defensive and already poised for a fight. Shamba just leapt at him, and Mike recognized immediately that the growls in the sudden spring was uncharacteristic. He bolted for the gate as fast as his geriatric legs could carry him. Had he been a few years younger, he'd have made it the short distance to the gate. But he was not a young man anymore. Shamba outstripped him almost instantly, ramming full force into Mike just as he reached out for the gate. The American started screaming in panic and fear. Lubanzi, on the other hand, had his rifle out and at the ready before Mike even reached the gate. He didn't dare fire at Shamba just yet, for fear of hitting Mike. Shamba hooked the elderly man with his claws, pulled Mike away from the gate that he was hanging onto for dear life, and dragged him across the ground. Mike went limp, not because fear had incapacitated him, but because he knew better than to put up a fight. If he reacted now, Shamba would retaliate to any sudden movement with murderous finality. So despite the burning pain in his jaw and the searing wounds on his back, Mike allowed himself to be dragged like a rag doll a few feet away, not even daring to yell out in pain. If he could scream, it would have been to tell the tourists to keep quiet. Their terrified yells and one of the women's hysterical crying were surely driving Shamba to even greater fury. The explosion of noise was just adding to the chaos. Lubanzi fired a round into the air, and Shamba was shaken out of his moment of madness for just long enough to let go of Mike. And still, Mike didn't move, but neither did Shamba. He stood over Mike like a predator guarding a kill, ready to square off with whoever fired the round. Lubanzi didn't need to take a second to decide. With Mike on the ground and finally out of Shamba's jaws, this was going to be the only chance Lubanzi had to save his boss's life. A second of hesitation was all that Shamba needed to finish Mike off, so Lubanzi fired the second round, hitting Shamba squarely in the chest. The lion bounded back from Mike, running around in a half circle, thoroughly confused at the sting in his chest, not realizing that he was mortally wounded. But the damage was done. The lion, now mad with pain, added to its already uncontrollable territorial instinct. It was a time bomb waiting to happen. Lubanzi took a moment to see if Mike was even still alive, but Mike was lying still as death. He turned back and fired 2 more shots. Shamba stumbled a few feet backwards, reeling from the blast, and fell dead on the ground. With the screams and yells still ringing in his ears, Lubanzi stepped into the enclosure, his rifle still raised in case Shamba wasn't as dead as he seemed, while another guide ran in after him and dragged Mike out by his armpits. Miraculously, Mike was conscious, and he even directed his staff on calling emergency services and on how to evacuate the traumatized tourists. To them, Mike looked like he was at death's door. The man was bleeding profusely from the grooves left by Shamba's claws in his back, and his jaw was very clearly broken. It was a wonder that Mike could even manage to talk. He was airlifted to Johannesburg within the hour, while Chrissy drove the couples to a local hotel. The visitors wanted nothing more than to get away from the sanctuary after their ordeal. Mike, accompanied by Lubanzi and his stepdaughter, waited all day to see him out of surgery. Mike, like he always had, just powered through it all. Besides his jaw being broken in 2 places from being rammed into the metallic gate, he had a dozen scratches that required more than 100 stitches. You'd think that Mike would call it a day and finally retire, but no. The Hodge family are still there, rescuing and raising the very predators that nearly took Mike's life. If anything, the sanctuary, the Hodges, and the staff mourned the loss of Shamba. They'd seen him grow up before their eyes, and they knew better than anyone that a wild animal will always be just that, wild. No one blamed Shamba, but Lubanzi did blame himself. He's never quite gotten over killing the king of the jungle. As thankful as he was that Mike could live to save another animal, he can't stop replaying the memory of Shamba's terrifying final affliction. Ashley Pfaff had been passionate about animals most of her life. She graduated from New Mexico State University with a biology degree in 2002. Afterwards, she secured a job at Colorado's Ocean Journey in Denver. This was mostly an aquarium showcasing a variety of freshwater and marine habitats and the animals within them. But it was also home to Sumatran tigers, sea otters, and birds. Ashley worked there for 3 years, gaining valuable experience of working with animals and under conservation programs designed to educate the general public. By the time she left the organization, she was an experienced zookeeper and was excited to begin her new role at Denver Zoo in the fall of 2005. Her new role meant she was looking after a variety of big cats, some polar bears, and sea lions. Duties included feeding the animals, cleaning out their enclosures, and giving educational talks to the paying public. It was a job that Ashley wholeheartedly threw herself into, and she relished every moment of it. But on February 24, 2007, just over a year after her first shift, tragedy struck. Ashley was assigned to clean out the Jaguar's cage that morning. She was experienced and had carried out that kind of work many times before. But this time, she made an error, a fatal error. Through carelessness or distraction, she failed to secure the Jaguar away whilst she worked inside a contained area of the feline building. The exact details will never be known, as there were no witnesses to the buildup of the event, but the following is one possible scenario. Ashley had finished clearing up the inside section of the Jaguar enclosure when she stepped outside. But as she did so, she failed to ensure that the Jaguar was locked away in the furthest indoor section. For some unknown reason, Ashley continued to work in the walkway without securing the metal door behind her. The Jaguar was a 6-year-old male. He had been born in a Santa Cruz Municipal Zoo of South American fauna, a Bolivian zoo, and was transferred to Denver in 2005. His name was Jorge, the Spanish for George, and he was named after President Bush. His keepers at the Bolivian facility had said how placid Jorge had been ever since birth, but his twin was a menace. He was often bullied by his brother, and the two of them would scrap, but Jorge would always appear to be the submissive one. Later that year at Denver Zoo, Jorge was due to be introduced to a 16-month-old female jaguar named Capora. Once the female was old enough, the two of them would share an enclosure together in the hope of joining the captive breeding program. Ashley and the rest of the zoo staff regularly underwent safety training, and she had shadowed veteran zookeepers before. When Jorge spotted Ashley walking along the caged corridor section, he began to walk towards her. He was curious. Normally, he was locked away indoors when staff worked in his outdoor section. He could smell the keeper and watched her as she swept the concrete floor. Ashley didn't notice the jaguar begin to move stealthily through his enclosure. In the wild, jaguars are native to Central and South America. They are masters of dense forest habitats and are obligate carnivores. They most often prey on capybara and giant anteaters, but will also take down deer, peccaries, turtles, and caimans. In captivity, however, they don't have the chance to catch live prey, and having a person inside its enclosure was stimulating. When he reached the metal gate, he nudged it curiously with his muzzle. It swung open. Ashley turned when she heard the metal hinges squeak slightly. Her heart missed a beat when she saw Jorge's head peer around the side of the doorway. He was loose. There was nothing between her and the big cat, with one of the strongest bite forces in the animal kingdom. Although the leopard had been born in captivity, he was still packed full of wild instinct, an instinct that still saw a moving target inside his enclosure as potential prey. Ashley hesitated, hoping upon hope that the jaguar would retreat back into its enclosure or turn the other way. She tried to steady her breathing and keep calm. She didn't want to excite him or entice him unnecessarily. She began to slowly reach down to her radio to call for backup, but then Jorge came for her. Before she could react, Jorge suddenly bounded across the concrete towards Ashley. She felt sick in the pit of her stomach as she knew what was coming. He covered the distance in less than a second. His paws were silent as he leapt across the open corridor. His eyes were fixed on Ashley's, and he went in for the kill. The jaguar jumped up at her and brought his jaws crushing down around the back of her neck. He weighed 140 pounds, 63 kilograms, and brought Ashley crashing down to the ground. She tried to fight him off. She could feel his warm body against hers as she was sandwiched between the predator and the cold concrete floor of the enclosure. He grappled with her, using his powerful paws to batter her around, bruising her and knocking the wind from her lungs. The force from the bite was overpowering, and she felt her neck give way, her vertebrae crushing and her muscles tearing. Ashley cried out, and at that moment a witness saw the legs of the keeper sticking out from underneath the jaguar and immediately raised the alarm. 4 times a year, staff are trained in how to respond to an animal out of containment. Some members of staff are trained in the use of firearms and tranquilizer darts. They rushed to the feline building. 4 of the 16 staff who were on duty that morning were at the scene within minutes of the attack. Everything they had trained for came down to this moment, and in an emergency like that, each moment counts. A tranquilizer dart can take 3 to 5 minutes to take effect. Ashley didn't have that time. Instead, they tried to scare the jaguar away with a fire extinguisher. This worked momentarily, but when staff were tending to Ashley, the jaguar came back at them and needed to be taken down. Zoo staff took aim and shot Jorge. He let out a surprised screech and reared backwards before rushing away and collapsing in another section of his enclosure. Emergency services had already been called and immediately began working on the young woman, but tragically, Ashley didn't make it. The 27-year-old died 90 minutes after the attack from a broken neck and extensive internal injuries. Staff were shocked about the death of a much-loved member of staff. She had worked for years with large carnivores and was considered experienced amongst the zoo staff. It was a tragedy that shook the close-knit zoo community to the core. Her friends and family were obviously devastated and needed answers. But the ordeal wasn't over yet. Jorge was still alive, but only just. He was severely injured from the gunshot wound, but the bullet hadn't killed him. Vets tried desperately to save him, but he had lost so much blood that they decided it was best to euthanize him. They were unable to find a suitable vein, and so decided to tranquilize him before cutting his jugular. He also died that day. The zoo had always maintained strict safety protocols. Staff were well versed in the handling of the animals, particularly those that could cause potential harm. Although it was allowed for zookeepers to work alone, those that did were briefed on the procedures to ensure their safety. The zoo was put under intense scrutiny following Ashley's untimely and tragic death. An investigation tried to determine exactly what happened and how the Jaguar and Ashley were allowed to come into contact with each other. All doors and locks were investigated, and none was found to be faulty. In the end, it was found that human error was to blame, and Ashley had failed to shut 2 of the connecting doors. Not only that, but she hadn't made sure that Jorge was locked away inside before she began working in the outdoor section. Her friends and family will never know why Ashley made these devastating mistakes, or exactly what happened in her last moments before meeting her terrifying final affliction. Tohoku Safari Park is situated near Nihonmatsu City in Japan's Fukushima Prefecture. The city offers a multitude of experiences for tourists, including Japanese castles, sake breweries, the drift racing track at Ibisu Circuit, and the safari park. As soon as visitors enter the park, they can either swap their own car for a safari vehicle or take their own one through the enclosures. The single-track road winds through the open spaces, taking the visitors on a journey through the mock wilderness. The park is divided into 11 areas in which some of the animals roam freely and cars can pass through. It allows visitors the unique opportunity to get up close to some of nature's most fascinating beasts. Safety here is paramount, and visitors are told to keep their windows and doors locked at all times whilst immersing themselves in the safari-like experience. There are more than 120 different species of animals at the facility, including giraffes, elephants, and lions. The first paddock to drive through is home to the lions. After driving through 2 security gates, visitors can begin searching for the pride. They can be easily concealed in the tall grass, on the hillside, or amongst the shrubs and bushes. Whilst it is not recommended to stop the car whilst viewing the lions, in the following enclosure, which is home to only herbivores, people are allowed to feed the animals from their car windows. Goats, camels, giraffes, elephant, and zebras stick their heads through the windows, sniffing for a treat, whilst visitors take some comical photos. Of course, the presence of such animals doesn't just require paying guests to be cautious. The keepers need to be careful too. Kenichi was a 53-year-old keeper who had worked as a zookeeper for 27 years. He was about as experienced as they come and had cared for the likes of bears, tigers, and lions. He was well-versed in animal husbandry procedures and how to care for a huge range of animals, from ring-tailed lemurs to full-grown elephants. Friday, September 29, 2023, started as a day like any other. Kenichi made his way to work as usual. One of his tasks for the day was to feed the lions that were inside the breeding facility at the time. He had done this thousands of times before. There were strict protocols in place to ensure the safety of employees, and Kenichi knew these like the back of his hand. That afternoon, at around 3 p.m., he had to separate the lions and get them into individual cages for them to be transported out of the breeding shed. He was armed with buckets of meat to lure the lions, one by one, into the metal cages. The procedure took patience and attention to detail. The most crucial part of the task was ensuring each door was securely fastened between the keeper and the lions. He threw some meat into the cages, and then Kenichi began enticing the first lion out of its enclosure and into the transportation cage. It was a female and was almost white in color. Her coat glistened. Her body was stocky and powerful. He waved the meat in front of him, and the lioness stood up. It looked hungrily at the meat and obediently began to walk towards it and the keeper. There were several locked doors between the enclosure and the final cage. They squeaked on their hinges as Kenichi opened them and closed them behind himself. He always remained one step ahead of the lion, and with one door separating the two. But something distracted him that day. For some unknown reason, Kenichi failed to secure the gates between him and the lion. Instead, he walked through the next one and failed to secure that one too. Maybe he felt confident that he knew the lions well enough and could trust them. Maybe he thought he had pulled the gates shut. Nobody will ever know. But as the lion progressed down the passageway towards the open cage, it realized that there was nothing between it the meat, and the keeper. It nudged the gates open one by one, eager for a meal. The bars wouldn't stop it now, as it was walking the same path as the keeper. Blood from the meat stained Kenichi's hand. It smelt good, a tantalizing feast right in front of the lion's eyes. It walked steadily forwards as it was supposed to do, but when Kenichi reached the cage door, there was nowhere for him to go. He backed up into the corner, watching as the lion continued to advance. There was nothing between the keeper and the cat. Did Kenichi now finally realize that he had made a mistake? What was going through his head as he came face to face with the lioness? Kenichi could see the glistening eyes of the female lion as she watched him, never blinking, never flinching. Her footsteps were slow and deliberate, each paw 13 centimeters, 5 inches across. Its claws almost 14 centimeters, 1.5 inches long, sharp and curved, made for clinging on to prey and bringing it down to the ground, tearing through tough hide and delivering fatal blows. When the lion was just feet from Kenichi, it rushed at him. It leapt upwards and brought him crashing down to the floor. The cold, hard, concrete floor. The power from the animal was overwhelming. Although Kenichi could see the attack coming and braced for impact, he was completely overpowered by the lioness. He tried to fight back. He tried to push the enormous cat off him. The fur felt soft, and the warmth of the lion's body pressed down on him. 300 pounds, 130 kilograms of muscle tied him down. The claws dug into his skin. He could feel them tearing at his muscle, threatening to rip him apart. The lioness instinctively went for Kenichi's throat. Although she had been born in captivity, her wild instincts were strong. The experienced keeper knew he was in trouble. He knew he had made a fatal mistake, and still he fought for survival. Reaching up with his hands, he tried to gouge the lion's eyes. If he could press his fingers into her eyes, then maybe she would let go. But in the commotion and chaos, he couldn't feel them. He kicked and he punched the predator, but his writhing and squirming only forced the lion to bite down harder. She tried to subdue her prey as quickly as possible. Kenichi yelled and screamed as he felt the lion close its jaws around his neck. The moisture from the lion's breath trickled down his chin, and then he gasped. The lion tore at his neck, and blood poured from the open wound. Kenichi felt himself grow drowsy. His head was spinning, and he was losing blood. Then everything went dark. Moments later, staff came rushing to the enclosure. They had heard Kenichi's desperate cries and knew something was wrong. When they arrived, they could see Kenichi lying still on the floor. The lioness was standing over him in the keeper's section of the breeding house. When they yelled, they startled the lion, and she immediately jumped off Kenichi and scuttled away into the far corner of the walkway. Staff secured the lioness behind locked doors and rushed to Kenichi's side. A dark pool of blood surrounded his head. His colleagues grabbed his neck and applied pressure. Kenichi was still alive. His heartbeat was weak and his breathing shallow, but he was still with them. It was now a race against time to stop him from bleeding and to stabilize him. An ambulance arrived on the scene, and Kenichi was rushed to a nearby hospital in Fukushima City, leaving his co-workers shocked and traumatized. Despite the best efforts of the paramedics and doctors to save Kenichi's life, it wasn't to be. Kenichi had put up a good fight, but he couldn't be saved. He had lost too much blood and sadly lost his life shortly after arriving at hospital. The incident made news headlines. There was shock amongst staff at the facility and visitors who frequented the park. The lions were always a highlight for people who came to see the wild animals. They were the first animals people would see when they drove through the towering security gates, and now one of them was responsible for the death of a worker. An investigation was immediately launched at the safari park. It remained closed until answers could be found. When officials searched the breeding facility, they found all the doors open. Even the cage doors were off their latches. Kenichi had failed to secure a single one of them. The lion had had full access to the keeper's area without any barriers. It was lucky other staff weren't in the vicinity at the same time. For such an experienced keeper to make such a catastrophic mistake is rare, but it was the last mistake Kenichi would ever make before his terrifying final affliction. When Andrew Oberly sat in class as an 8-year-old boy, his second-grade teacher taught him and his fellow pupils about Jane Goodall and her amazing research and life with chimpanzees in Africa. He rushed home, inspired by the story, and told his mother then and there that when he grew up, he wanted to work with chimps. There was something about them that fascinated him. He spent as much time as he could at zoos as a child, and then as an adult. He would sit in front of the chimp enclosures and observe their behavior. He would watch them on TV documentaries, demonstrating their tool use, their cleverness, and human-like qualities. His chance at fulfilling a lifetime's ambition came when he was studying for his master's degree in anthropology and primatology at the University of Texas at San Antonio. He arranged to research chimp behavior at South Africa's Chimp Eden for his dissertation project. The sanctuary was founded by Eugene Cussons in collaboration with the Jane Goodall Institute in 2006 to house rescued chimps from Central Africa. Many of the great apes have been victims of the bushmeat trade, having watched their parents butchered by poachers and left to fend for themselves. Others were used as entertainment and forced to perform tricks or subjected to unspeakable cruelty and left in solitary cages all their lives until they were rescued. When Andrew arrived at the sanctuary, he was in heaven. It was exactly the kind of work he had waited his entire life for, and he was eager to get stuck into his research. But tragedy was waiting for him just around the corner. After less than a month working at Chimp Eden, he was giving a tour to some visitors when disaster struck. He paused outside the all-adult enclosure to speak about the individuals they had there and their past history when he spotted a large stone just on the other side of the low-lying electric fence. He casually stepped over the wire and removed the stone. It was something that the chimps could easily have picked up and hurled at unsuspecting visitors. But as Andrew went to step back over the electric wire, he suddenly felt a sharp tug on his legs. The adult males were enraged by the intruder. Although Andrew had meant no harm, he was still in their territory without their permission. They dragged him across the dry ground for more than 30 feet and began pummeling him with their fists. The blows rained down on the young student as he tried to protect himself. A keeper, who saw the attack unfolding, honked the horn of his vehicle and leant out the window and fired a warning shot from his gun. But the crack from the firing gun did nothing to deter the chimps. They savaged Andrew, their sharp teeth cutting into his flesh, ripping at his skin and muscle, tearing it. Even with adrenaline pumping through his body, the pain was indescribable. At first, Andrew begged with the chimps to stop. He knew them individually. That's what added to the pain of the trauma, the fact that he had worked with these animals and to some degree believed that he had gained some kind of trust or mutual understanding with them. "Nicky, Amadeus, stop it, please don't," he cried. But it didn't work. They continued their brutal attack. Amadeus lifted Andrew's hand up to his mouth and bit his fingers off one by one. It was like a form of cruel torture. Andrew could only watch as the chimp looked him directly in the eyes while it bit off his fingers one at a time. Andrew was horrified. Then he felt the warm, moist breath of Nicky on his face. He stood on Andrew's chest, pinning him down, and brought his hairy face within an inch of Andrew's. He could smell his breath. He could feel wisps of the chimpanzee's facial fur on his cheek. And then, quick as a flash, Nicky the chimp lunged forwards and bit Andrew's nose clean off. As the attack continued, Andrew didn't think it would ever stop. He could feel the damage the chimps were doing, and nothing he tried would stop them. He had tried to talk to them calmly, trying to make them understand that he was no threat. Then he begged them to stop, and finally he tried to fight back. But with each fully grown male having the strength of 5 men, he didn't stand a chance. Another chimp launched itself at the keeper's vehicle as he tried to stop the attack. It smashed the windscreen and dented the hood, threatening to break into the vehicle and attack him. Instead, he raised his gun and fired through the glass, injuring the chimp, which ran off into the enclosure, closely followed by the others. The chimps had torn Andrew's scalp, peeling the skin back over his skull. They had bitten off both of his ears, half of his right foot, and all the toes from his left foot. The powerful blows that came crashing down on his torso collapsed his lung, and he was left gasping for air by the time the attack was over. He was rushed to the nearest emergency medical clinic. It was a small doctor's surgery, but the staff there saved his life. They used 25 units of blood just to keep him alive whilst they dressed his wounds. He was then transferred to hospital in Johannesburg, where he underwent emergency surgery. He was placed in an induced coma and given an emergency tracheotomy. His parents, who were in the United States, were called and received the devastating news. Andrew was in terrible shape, and they should try and get over to South Africa as quickly as possible. His mother was told not to get her hopes up. Andrew's chances of survival were slim. He spent 2.5 weeks in the induced coma, whilst doctors worked around the clock to tend to his battered and torn body. When he woke up, he saw his parents smiling down at him. He remembered the attack, but couldn't work out where he was. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Then he tried to move his head, but every inch of his body was sore. When he did manage to look down at his body, all he could see were bloodied bandages from head to toe. He couldn't believe the mess he was in. He couldn't believe the damage that had been done. Then, when the realization of the situation sunk in, he began to feel the physical pain that came from being shredded by the chimpanzees. Most of his backside had been torn off. A goal the doctors set Andrew was for him to sit at the end of his hospital bed for 2 minutes. If he could manage that, then he could fly home and continue his recovery over in the States. His longing for home and to see his faithful dog again drove him to keep going. But sitting up was more difficult than he ever imagined. The pain was incredible. Even when the doctors conducted bandage changes, he was pumped full of painkillers. His mother would place a towel over his head and some headphones over his ears so that he could try and escape the pain of it all. But gradually, day by day, he managed to move a little bit more, until one day, 5 weeks after waking from his coma, Andrew finally managed to sit up for the full 2 minutes. He was on the plane to America in a matter of days, where he met some incredible doctors and plastic surgeons to try and fix his broken face and body. At the St. Louis University Hospital, Chief of Plastic and Reconstructive Surgery, Dr. Bruce Kramer, took skin and muscle from Andrew's belly to fix his wrist. He then rearranged the tendons in his wrist, enabling Andrew to move it once again, and even get the use of his thumb back, which he lost during the attack but was sewn back on. Using the skin from Andrew's forehead and the cartilage from his ribs, Dr. Michael Bernstein reconstructed Andrew's nose. It took time for Andrew to come to terms with the attack that left him scarred for life. It changed him in so many ways, but due to the strong support network around him from family and friends, to doctors, surgeons, and mental health specialists, he was able to recover. He found a new determination to finish his master's thesis. It wasn't going to be the same one he started out in South Africa. He wasn't able to work with chimps again, but this one he completed behind his computer in the comfort of his mother's home. He was eventually awarded his master's and walked out on the stage on his new prosthetics to collect his certificate on Mother's Day, with his mother watching proudly on. Since then, Andrew has helped to set up the Oberly Institute, a trauma program that helps patients thrive in recovery and get back out into the world after devastating and life-changing events. But no matter the amount of trauma recovery programs Andrew has taken, he can never escape the terrifying memories of the day he had his face ripped apart by 2 chimpanzees, narrowly escaping his horrifying final affliction. All jobs come with a certain level of risk and danger, depending on what the job entails. Some jobs are obviously more dangerous than others, as a shop clerk probably doesn't have the same risk of bodily harm as a miner. Even more mundane jobs are risky. Lifeguards risk drowning every day, while pilots might die in a plane crash at any moment. But what about a zookeeper? You would think that this life choice would be relaxing and stress-free, as they can play with small animals whenever they want and marvel at the exotic animals that the general public are not given close access to. But you would be wrong. 62% of zookeepers have disclosed that they have received injuries at work from the animals that they care for, including the cute and cuddly ones. This job requires you to work in close quarters with some of the most dangerous animals in the world that would kill you in a second if they were given the chance. The chimpanzee, tiger, or the fearsome brown bear are all deadly animals that zookeepers routinely work alongside. If the zoo lacks proper stimulation for the animals, these predators will begin to search for their own entertainment, leading to the zookeepers finding their way onto the animals' menu. Uzbekistan is the largest country in Central Asia, and while the country is relatively unknown across the world, it is home to a wide range of animal species. One of the most interesting of these native species is the Himalayan brown bear, which can stand at 7 feet tall with strong, sharp claws. Unfortunately, due to poaching, this animal has fallen into the critically endangered status, leading zoos to begin conservation efforts to save these creatures. These powerful bears need to have an engaging environment in which to thrive, but Uzbekistan is not exactly equipped to give these animals what they need, leading to problems with the bears, problems that can begin to gain a body count. There is a rampant problem with Asian zoos and some questionable ethical practices within these zoos, which can lead to the animals and the keepers being at risk. In January 2023, a zookeeper known only as AG in Uzbekistan was working his usual shift, tending to the brown bears. The young man had been working there for a while and knew the ins and outs of his job so much that it had become like second nature to him. On this particular day, he had been assigned to the Himalayan brown bear enclosure, where he was asked to clean the living quarters and leave food for the solitary bear. He had always been wary of this animal, as it dwarfed him in size, and it had always seemed quite agitated in its enclosure, which he had always believed was too small for the beast, as it repetitively paced back and forth at the glass. As he prepared to enter the enclosure, he made sure to lock the animal into a separate gated area to keep it as far away from him as possible as he entered its home. He couldn't quite remember when it had last been fed, as he hadn't been working the day before, but he hoped it was recently, as he locked eyes with the huge bear staring at him through the gate. He avoided eye contact as much as he could as he began to sweep the floors and discard any waste on the floor. It wasn't a glamorous job, but he definitely enjoyed it. Once he was finished, he shot a glance at the animal behind the gate and was relieved to see it was still there, meaning that he was safe. He shuddered as he thought of what would happen if he somehow ended up face to face with such a massive predator. Unfortunately, this thought would become a horrifying reality very soon. AG was just finishing off his work in the bear enclosure and started to distribute the food to hide it from the animal, hoping to provide some kind of enrichment for the captive bear. He knew he couldn't do much to improve its standard of living, but he would always try his best, regardless, as he hid pieces of meat in tiny corners. He was so engrossed in his work that he didn't realize the life-threatening mistake he had made. The bear had come through the gate, shortening the distance between the zookeeper every second as the man continued his job, oblivious to the danger behind him. As he finished with his task, he slowly turned around as he thought about the best way to release the bear with as little resistance as possible. But to his horror, the bear was already in the enclosure and walking towards him with a determination that made the zookeeper feel sick to his stomach. Panicking, the man began to make a break for it as he sprinted towards the exit, but the bear easily stopped him before he even got close. The bear knocked AG to the ground with one swipe and immediately climbed on top of him. The terrified man began to scream for help, knowing that his colleagues would be close by and they might be able to come and save him before it was too late. The bear only became more excited as AG screamed. He tried in vain to push the bear off of him, but its 300-kilogram weight overpowered him with ease, keeping him pinned to the ground as the animal assessed the best way to begin its meal. With an easy decision made, the bear bit down on the zookeeper's neck again and again, ripping and tearing at his flesh as it did so. Blood spurted across the enclosure, covering the bear's face and making the whole situation resemble that of a horror movie. AG lay pinned to the ground and watched helplessly as his throat was ripped from his body, finally killing him. But the bear was not done with the zookeeper and had no intention of stopping. Even though its prey was now dead, it was ready to eat. The other zookeepers on the shift had seen the whole thing and knew that their colleague was dead from the sheer amount of blood that now stained the bear's face. It was horrifying to see, but they had to get the body back before the bear had a chance to devour it. So they cautiously entered the enclosure with the man-eating bear. They began to throw wooden planks and stones at the animal, scared that any movement might entice the animal to attack them next. And seeing their blood-soaked colleague lying dead on the floor, they were determined that they would not suffer from the same fate. Instead of retreating as they hoped, the bear grabbed AG's limp body and began to drag it further into the center of the enclosure so that it could guard its meal. Seeing that their plan wasn't working, the zookeepers grabbed long sticks to hit the bear with and push it away from the body. While the bear was becoming more agitated, it retreated from its meal for long enough that the workers were able to run in and grab the body before either of them was attacked. They dragged the mauled man behind the gate and slammed it shut, radioing their supervisors to come and help, but they knew it was too late. It was clear that AG had been killed as the blood poured from his neck and chest and soaked into the sand around them. An investigation was launched into the accident to assess exactly what had happened. The zoo was temporarily closed down while this was happening to make sure that no visitors were present as they tried to contain the situation as much as possible. They knew no one would ever visit them again with such a tarnished name. The name of the zookeeper was even hidden from the media, although this could also be to respect the privacy of the grieving family as they are forced to come to terms with how their son died. Following the investigation, it was found that the park was severely lacking in a lot of the safety requirements that are in place to keep their staff safe. From proper staff training to adequate enclosures, the park was in a lot of trouble. Blame was also partly given to AG, as it was eventually reported that he failed to close the gate properly and didn't check it after to ensure that it was definitely closed, which led to the bear escaping. It is virtually impossible to place 100% of the blame on one person or another, but the death of the unnamed zookeeper rocked the country of Uzbekistan and worked as an example of the power of these wild animals and how they should be left alone. As of today, the zoo is still open to the public. The animals are still living in horrible conditions, and the death of AG was quietly swept under the rug. So long as zoos across the world are allowed to operate without many rules and regulations, another attack is inevitable, leading to someone else's horrifying final affliction.